pretty well set for the moment. So let's go ahead and open the May 18th, 2022 version of the Water Committee. As always, we start with the opportunity for the public to visit, speak their mind on any subject relevant to the meeting we're here for today. Would anybody like to come forward and speak? If you would, just please state your name and address, please.
Yes, good morning. It's Alex Rudd, 68 La Concepcion, Kendall County. Thank you. I've seen your last meeting, and I fully understand the need for planning, the urgency of having adequate water. It's a public safety issue, and also how difficult and challenging your job is going to be. I have 3 kids at home who are still in school. My oldest has grown and he's left. My youngest is 13. My daughter's graduating high school this year. I want them all to have opportunities in this state. I have no desire to slam shut the gates, put us back in the days of a horse and buggy, shut industry down, or cut back opportunities. I want a healthy economy in Texas. But I also believe that we need to have a balanced approach as we face these challenges we have. I want them to live in a state that's economically stable, safe, healthy, clean air and water, desirable place to live, and certainly not a nonstop version of Houston from one border to the other. Briefly, I grew up in, and this is all dealing with water, I'll get to the point, but I grew up in southeastern Massachusetts, surrounded by 5 polluted lakes. Nobody swam. There was no water recreation. We would occasionally go fishing, and sometimes the fish were covered with sores, bloated, deformed, unrecognizable, depending on which lake you went to. Some were worse than others. One time we went wading, me and my brother, it was 100 degrees. We said, let's just get our feet wet. Came out, I was covered with pink slime. I had a rash for 2 weeks. This was in a state that's fairly affluent, has a very high tax base, and this is what happened back in the late 1980s. I don't want this to happen to our state. And right now, going to different meetings, I'm aware that we have problems in all directions, including a water supply. However, I believe that we need a comprehensive and collaborative approach to all of these problems together. And I know it's not your job to manage development or environmental issues. I know that your job is to find water. I fully appreciate that, and I know we need to find water. However, we also have issues with development. We have issues with the state legislature. We have issues with transportation, environmental protection, resource protection. And my perception is that I'm hearing time and time again, well, that's not what we do. You know, go talk to your state legislature. I was in a commissioner's court meeting, and they made decisions that they hated. And I was asking, what can we do? And I was actually asking them to help a bit. And they told me, well, go talk to your state legislature. It's frustrating. I'd love to talk to my state legislature, but I camp out there till I die with a tent, and I'm just one person. We need help from our local leadership on all of these. On the water issue, I just want to briefly mention several points. I think I went over this a few months ago. The supplies we have right now as we seek out water are very unpredictable. The 1950s drought of record may not be the best planning tool. Our population is exponentially higher. Our demands are exponentially higher. Will these sources that we're proposing right now be available if we enter and continue a mega drought that's become a disaster to our west? Will that eventually cover Texas, including eastern Texas, Gonzales County? If that does happen, we may be faced with a crisis that we're not even anticipating. Some of the methods that have been proposed, such as desalination, I'm sure you know about the drawbacks, cost, facilities, disposal of the brine. I know brackish water is different than salt water from the ocean, but one source I have so far cites 1.5 gallons of brine per gallon of fresh water produced. That's a lot of toxic material that's difficult to safely dispose of. It's toxic to marine life. If you pump it back into the ground, you risk contaminating the groundwater. Wastewater reprocessing, I'm a proponent of reusing wastewater. I hate to waste water. I don't like to see water go down into a place where it cannot be reused. However, the proposal of toilet to tap Although it has many good sides, as a medical background, I do have concerns about pharmaceutical residues that may be present even in microdoses that are not detected through typical analysis methods. Often in chemistry analysis, you will find what you're looking for, and it depends on the parameters you set. If you are not looking for a compound, you may not find it. And when you have water that's heavily processed, heavily chlorinated, and it goes through multiple steps, you may end up with unknown compounds that are formed by the combination of the processing and the pharmaceutical residues and other toxins that are in that water. The long-term effects of consuming this water have not been studied. It may take decades to find out, and it would have to be actively searched for. One of the things that we know for sure is that fetal development is very susceptible to very tiny doses of compounds, and we need to keep a close eye on this. One of the biggest issues that I see right now, and I could talk for an hour about this, is stewardship of our existing water sources. As we make water plans for the future, we must address and improve our environmental quality controls. I've brought up a few times that our wastewater treatment here in Bernie, within a priority groundwater management area that's uniquely sensitive, has been studied by UTSA and found to have harmful pharmaceutical residues and hormone compounds that are known to be toxic to aquatic life. These are also very suspect to cause harm to human health. Again, most likely with long-term exposure and especially to fetal development. We would need to upgrade our wastewater treatment facilities. And I believe that steps like this should be part of a comprehensive water plan, not just finding more water and getting more water for the future, but also improving our protection of our existing water. I don't know how much these upgrades will cost. I know that budgets are a concern, taxpayers are fed up, but all of these need to be looked at. And it won't just be your job. I know that you guys have more than you need on your plate, and I fully respect that. This may be an opportunity to engage all of these entities together in our state and finally get our state legislator to wake up, our legislatures to wake up and realize we are in trouble. We need reasonable development planning. I'm not saying stop development, but can we really afford to create a megatropolis from San Antonio to Austin and beyond? I've heard words during city council that the purpose of more water is not growth. I know we need a backup water supply, yet at the same time, in a recent edition of the Bernie Star, it's talking about Kendall County becoming part of this megatropolis, this urbanized area. This is confusing to the public. You know, you're like, okay, we hear this from you, we get this from the paper. We don't really know what the plans are. Another issue, and I'll try to wrap this up, our Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and our legislature favors industry and business across the board. The privacy and interest of super users in Travis County are protected. I saw those points discussed at your last meeting. They can use as much as they want. We have no right to know how much. It's very hard to dig that up, what they're using it for, and how much they plan to use in the future. Do we know for sure that all of these industries are really benefiting our economy, or are they just here because we have cheaper water? Will they move on once our water becomes more expensive? Is there a way that we can change our legislature to at least have some opportunity to evaluate these issues? We also need to consider the future. I don't want to see this happen. Is it possible that down the road we may hit the point where water is so scarce and so expensive that ultimately the economic boom that we're seeing will stop? Businesses will leave, our economy will suffer, we'll be left with the economic and environmental fallouts of unmitigated and poorly planned development, and we'll be left with generations who will have to suffer with what's left of our state. I encourage and ask that you help engage other agencies, including local council, local government, state legislature, environmental scientists, planning, development. All of these can come together and work together. The water problem is not isolated. It includes all of these issues. And I know you have a very tough job. I don't want to make it harder, but I'd like to see more cooperation on these efforts. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your comments. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Lisa Del Puerto, 317 Lakeview Drive in Bernie. I did not come as well prepared as Alex did, but I must say that most of her comments are extremely well said. Basically, I used to work at San Francisco Water before I retired here. And yes, they had a wonderful water power. They had money. They put in many reservoirs. They upgraded their wastewater treatment plants, Oceanside, blah, blah, blah. They did a lot of climate change studies and found out that their water treatment plant on the east side would be underwater if there was a sea level rise. So there are all kinds of things that are going on with inside of this particular system. I understand that Texas is different, and I was very concerned when I moved here. It wasn't only because of KB homes being put in, but that's 300 more people. I'm on a well. Our water source is only one large lake here. Now, I didn't see any reservoirs. I don't know if you guys have any tanks. I don't know if you have well backup systems in case you have drought. I don't know if you're going to do any wind sourcing. Hill country is wonderful on wind. You get your power from that. That would be a great thing to do. I was hoping that you'd have like what they have a mobilization plan for transportation, where the public goes in and they say, "What oh, this is our plan. We have a master plan for water here in Bernie." So we get our water sourcing taken care of. I would even say you need 2 more Lake Bernies because, with the population going up, you really need that water source. And also, I worked in the water quality laboratory. We were very specialized. We had our chemists who did we had specialized chemists to look at all the different kinds of contaminants that were in the water. They were doing pharmaceuticals in the water, testing. I was on the biological side, water, wastewater, parasitology was my big thing. And then we had a PhD doing from EPA who was working with us doing antitoxin testing for the algae and mitigation for that. We have limnologists who go out to the lakes and they would do depth studies. They bring back samples. We would do hundreds of samples every week. We had a sample siting plan. We went out there and did our thing. I've been up country all the way to O'Shaughnessy Dam, to the Tuolumne River, to the headwaters, collecting 100 liters of water, bringing it back down, filtering it out for parasitology, getting it down to a little slide where I'd look under the fluorescent microscope and see how many cysts we'd had in our water, Giardia, especially crypto. So I'm wondering what your water plan, how your laboratories work, how well your wastewater systems work, and with all these extra people here, can you handle that? I'm really into the rainwater collection. We're going to be putting in our rainwater barrels behind our 4-car garage. And what else? They're downtown in San Francisco. They have a LEEDS, their home base, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission home base. They're a LEEDS building. So that means any water that comes down from the toilets or anything, they have a filtration system. Now, everything is really expensive, but they do also have filtration systems in the city where I came from, Burlingame, where they had it along the roadways, where they have filtration systems where they can gather that and have it semi-cleaned before it gets to the wastewater treatment plants. In 2000, I started in 98. In 2000, just before 2001, they allowed us to go into the O'Shaughnessy Dam to see the structures inside and the bypass valves. And I learned quite a bit about we worked on a site that had the plumbers, the electricians, and everybody else. So they would go out, and we'd have the guys who'd collect all the samples. We'd have the plumbers go out, and they'd be, doing all the water lines and right-of-ways and everything else. So I'm wondering, money-wise, with the tax base that you probably don't have hotels and everything, how you'd be able to gather all this money to be able to build reservoirs or put in extra tanks. But I would really seriously consider having some extra emergency water and really pushing for people who can do it for the rainwater barrel collections, because that's thousands and thousands of gallons of water that they could save the city. I know I'm all over the place, but I'm hoping that I can see from this group something of a master plan, if it's possible, for emergency backup water and water supply growth. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else like to speak? Anyone on the Zoom wanting to speak? All right. I don't see anyone else out in the audience, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next portion of the agenda. For those who were here last time or may have read about it otherwise, Mr. Nichols with GBRA made a presentation to the city following our last meeting with the intention of sharing some of the things we'll be talking about today. There are a handful of projects that are going on to work on supply side issues, and there sounded like there might be some immediacy to that. And I think it was a consensus of the group that that's information that should be shared with the city sooner rather than later, and so it was. I asked Mr. Nichols to provide some comments just so we could share an overview of the topic and what he discussed with the city. So I'll read that into the record briefly. The city utility develops and implements a water plan. The purpose of Mr. Nichols' discussion with the city was to encourage the council to be more involved with understanding what is included in its planning effort for growth inside the city, outside the city, and for industrial and economic development needs. He asked the council to consider what additional information or direction it would like for the utility to consider in development of that plan, including what if growth accelerates faster than projected, what if developments are more dense or there are more LUEs per acre than was originally used for master planning, whether providing water to areas in the ETJ or outside the city might be a way to manage what development outside the city itself looks like, and what long-term impacts will development outside the city have on the city's current water supply sources. He also identified future water supply options available to the city, including the issue that's taking place east of the I-35 corridor and the efforts taking place to bring more water up into our area. He mentioned that there are political issues as well as supply side issues, and that the demand is overall very strong. And so those were the highlights of, or some of the highlights of Mr. Nichols' presentation to City Council a while back. He's unfortunately was not able to be here today, but I wanted to make sure that we circled back on that. That is one of the important factors that we'll need to get more information on and share with the city. And so some of the topics that will be addressed today will hit on the periphery of that, and others will be on point with that. So I don't have anything further on summary of prior business. So I'd rather, unless anyone has anything else, I'm going to move on to our action items or our new business. Mark Freiberg has come to tell us a little bit about Aquifer Authority, and the reason he's here was there was some discussion about alternate sources. Naturally, we have a neighbor to the south and east in Saws, and there's a possibility of sharing water or entering into agreements there to share some water with Saws or some other body, but there are legal impediments, and Mark's going to speak about those today.
Sure, thank you. I'm Mark Freeberg. I'm with the Edwards Aquifer Authority. This topic doesn't lend itself to a lengthy presentation, but I'm happy to talk about the ins and outs of how Edwards water can be used both inside our jurisdictional boundaries and outside of it. For some context, the EAA's regulatory authority, our boundaries, include all of Uvalde County, all of Medina County, all of Bexar County, portions of Comal, portions of Hayes, portions of Caldwell, portions of Guadalupe, and portions of Atascosa. And those portions are important because of the original intent of our enabling legislation. So in 93, when the bill that created the Edwards was passed, one of the provisions within that bill is water withdrawn from the Edwards Aquifer has to be used within the boundaries of the Edwards Aquifer Authority. So there was essentially a no export clause within our enabling legislation, which continued in 1996 when we were legally allowed to begin operations. The strange makeup of our jurisdictional boundaries, and I say strange because it goes down into Caldwell, Guadalupe, and portions of Atascosa, where the Edwards is saline enough not to be used. But the reason our jurisdictional boundaries go down that far is because there's infrastructure in place that uses fresh Edwards water, and that infrastructure was in place at the time our enabling legislation passed, and therefore, since it was going to be used in those areas, our boundaries had to include those areas. For, I guess, the past 25 years, we've issued what is a cap on the amount of water that can be withdrawn from the Edwards. We permit 572,000 acre-feet of water every year. We cannot permit any more than that. We've issued all the permits that we're allowed to issue under law. And that cap is unique in the state of Texas. No other groundwater district has a hard ceiling cap on the amount of water that they can permit to be withdrawn. And that in itself is one of the reasons for the prohibition on export. The idea at the time, and I'm surmising it's not in the legislative history, is that if you were going to cap the amount of water that can be used within this region, and at that time there were no alternative supplies within the region, that you needed to ensure that that water was going to be used within the region for its growth and for its needs. There's been two attempts to adjust this prohibition. In 2003, there was a bill that was filed, both in the House and in the Senate, that would allow Edwards water to be used within certificates of convenience and necessity that originated within the Edwards boundaries, but that went outside of their boundaries, so long as the majority of the CCN was within the Edwards boundaries and that it was an original permit holder. That bill did not pass. It wasn't necessarily a controversial bill. It just didn't get past the finish line. It ran out of time and died. And then in, I think it was 2019, maybe 2017, there was a bill that was filed that was, again, a CCN bill, but it also included a wholesale provision so long as the wholesale happened to a county that was adjacent to Bexar County, and it would allow SAWS to wholesale water outside of the EAA boundaries. And that bill was vetoed by the governor. It passed the House and the Senate, but it was vetoed by the governor for, I'm sure, various reasons. But the main contentious part of that bill was the wholesale provision within that bill. Didn't get as much attention in the CCN provisions of that bill. I feel fairly confident that some discussions regarding the CCN will continue this next session simply because of growth and simply because of infrastructure and how that works. Wholesale will continue to be a significant controversial topic. But at this point in time, from the Edwards perspective, the law is what the law is, and it's really an issue that is up to the policymakers at the legislature. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have over any of these issues or over Edwards management.
Well, so what's the authority's opinion on selling this water out of region?
On the wholesale provisions?
Wholesale, yeah.
The last bill that was filed, we took a neutral position. Our board essentially did not step into the politics of the position, and the reason for that was that under our current legal tools and under our current management tools, wholesale doesn't impact the way we would manage the aquifer. The cap doesn't change. We have a habitat conservation plan and conservation measures that go along with that plan that are required under a Fish and Wildlife Service permit. So if the water's not used within our boundaries, it still is subject to the cap that we have. And therefore, our management of the water, of its use, and of spring flow and other conservation measures doesn't change. So we saw it as a political decision and a policy decision that really needed to be made by the legislature, who put the prohibition on export in the bill in the first place. So we were neutral on the bill. We testified and gave background information, but we were neutral on the bill.
And then as far as your current use, I mean, I think I saw recently that you guys are now in stage 3, or at least SAWS is. Is that correct? I mean,
we're in stage 2.
You're in stage 2, okay. But I guess the only reason I'm asking that is, given that you have this cap, how secure do you think, with continued growth, is there capacity to keep feeding that and also to buffer and maintain that rate, that cap? In other words, when do you hit the wall, I guess?
Well, in a sense, we've hit the wall because we've issued all the permits. Currently, 2021's use was in the mid 300,000s, I believe. I haven't seen the report based on all annual use reports that come in. It's going to be given at our next board meeting. I believe it's in the 340s, but don't quote me on that. Use hasn't really gone over 430,000. Historically, we know that there is going to be a time when use is up against that 572. Our critical period reductions won't change based on growth. They will stay the same. I think really the question is, you're not going to be able to grow off the Edwards. The Edwards is a finite supply. It's the alternative supplies that are going to come in that would allow for that growth. And how does that get managed? From the EAA's perspective, we support the alternative supplies coming in because it helps us manage under our current cap and under the current management scheme that's in place. And so we'll continue to manage that way. Our critical period, our permit reductions and our cutbacks that you're speaking of will continue to be implemented in the same way. When you look at the 2011-2015 drought, we feel pretty confident that our scheme proved viable and how the springs responded and how aquifer levels responded through our management during that drought. We didn't have the conservation measures in place that we have today that are associated with our habitat conservation plan. Those were in their infancy, and they're now fully implemented and robust. So, we may have a chance to test it in these coming years, but that's essentially where we are. We're not going to be this source of growth. We're going to manage where we are, and the alternative supplies will fill in. Now, how the Edwards is used in conjunction with those alternative supplies, that's really up to the user, so long as it's following our permitting provisions.
Anything else, Ben?
Not at this moment. I'd be curious to hear what other people ask and take it from there.
Anyone else have?
Sure, I have a comment. From being a former City of Boerne employee, just to lay that out there, now I'm just a committee member here. But when my time at the city, we were never interested in buying Edwards water. We were interested in buying some of SAW's other supplies and could not do it because the molecules are mixed. That's the issue. To me, it's not the city wants to grow off the Edwards or even take any of that water until we can figure out how you can let the city buy some other supply, as you mentioned, new sources that San Antonio has done a good job of creating, and I'm sure we'll create more in the future. That's the access the city of Boerne would be looking for, the other supplies.
And we understand that, there wasn't that mixing of molecules in 1993, and I think that's really the policy discussion that needs to be had. In our discussions with the CCN issue, you now have every entity that's on the boundaries of our jurisdictional boundaries whose CCN extends beyond has an infrastructure that's in place that technically is capable of taking Edwards molecules outside of our boundaries, but they're also blending their water. They have alternative supplies, and that's something that needs to be addressed. We're not comfortable by just making a blanket statement that because it's mixed and the molecules are mixed that it doesn't violate that provision in the Act, but we're completely open to having that discussion. And we think that's the discussion that's probably going to take place this next legislative session.
Okay. So that still is a legislative decision to do that because of the way EAA was created.
Right. That's at least our board's position, that we feel like we'd be stepping beyond the language of the act if we were to look at it differently than that. Edwards water is Edwards water until it's proven differently. Now, if SAWS could prove that there was no Edwards molecules, that's different, but that's an extremely expensive proposition, and I don't know that that's a reasonable way to regulate anybody.
Has that discussion been initiated for revising the legislation in such a way that it clarifies?
We will be filing a bill this session, and we've talked to the entities that have CCNs that go beyond our boundaries in doing so. The problem is they're not using Edwards molecules outside of our boundaries, but they're technically capable of doing so. So we need some direction on that. I don't know that bill is going to go anywhere this session, but it will be a talking point, and our plan is to have this bill filed. We don't have a sponsor at this point in time, but we want to make sure that the discussion takes place. Our direction, at least my direction from our board, is that the bill would be limited solely to CCN. And so that they're not interested in discussing a wholesale provision at this point in time.
Okay. But I guess the point of the matter is the board is moving from a neutral position to needing clarity on this legislation and getting that clarity.
Correct.
Okay. So that should help fill in the gaps one way or another. I mean, something definitive as opposed to, well, this is what we think it means. And
we hope so.
This is how we've been acting going forward. Okay.
So you guys have been active in some land conservation efforts, and obviously we're kind of part of the contributing zone, and the region's growing rapidly. Is that assumed to be necessary? In other words, to maintain some open space in order for the current hydrological paradigm to be maintained?
Sure. We feel it's vitally important to protect the historic recharge that comes to the Edwards. I mean, our permitting scheme is based on historic recharge. That's why we have the 572. It takes into account historically how the Edwards has replenished itself, and if that recharge goes away, it's problematic for the system as a whole. So, the city of San Antonio has done a lot of work to protect that historic recharge, and we're taking some steps out there to assist as well. We think it's important it's a mitigation against growth, to preserve the system's natural ability, both in the contributing zone and the recharge zone, because the water coming off the contributing zone is what goes in the recharge zone. So we think it's important to find ways to incentivize protection of those properties.
Mm-hmm. And going back for just a moment, has the draft legislation been prepared?
No, sir. No, sir. We're happy to share it once it is.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful if you don't mind. It'd be interesting to get a look at that and where the EA is coming from and how it might move forward. Okay. Just since we're on the topic and we've got you here, in terms of conservation measures, what have you guys seen that worked out? I know that we've covered this in another chapter earlier, but it never hurts to go back and re-ask the question, and I haven't put you on the spot about that before. So.
No, we're a little unique in that our conservation measures aren't tied directly to consumption and use. When we implement our curtailment provisions, every time we go into a different stage, your permit is cut back by a percentage, and that percentage is on a yearly basis, and so it's pro rata. We don't stay in those stages for a year, but we ask the user to find a way to meet our cutbacks. We don't get into their business on how they find a way. So there's always confusion on, well, the Edwards is implementing stage 2. That means I can only water my lawn once every week. We don't get into those details. We just tell the permit holder that they're going to have to cut back by 20%. They need to find a way to do that. But beyond that, we do require users, if they are permitted beyond a certain amount, to implement conservation plans. And that includes, general good practices on when you irrigate, other BMPs that are appropriate to conserve water, so we can avoid waste. The major endeavors that we take from a conservation perspective, I think, have a lot to do with what Mr. Eldridge was talking about when we talk about conservation easements. We manage a significant leasing, and essentially it's an option contract, but we call them forbearance contracts. Every year we control about 101,000 acre-feet of water, and we have provisions in our contracts where we can require that water to be taken off the table to help mitigate against drought. and we compensate the permit holder for non-use, so to speak. So a lot of our contracts are with irrigators, and so depending on different environmental conditions, they'll trigger our option calls, and those irrigators will be compensated to not pump the following year. And we hope that that mitigates against...
Sort of an ERCOT model.
Yes, and hopefully that keeps mitigate against drawdown and against and helps supply spring flow. That's kind of, those are our major conservation components. We have conservation grants whereby we're trying to eradicate flood irrigation. We want irrigators to implement more conservation-minded irrigation techniques, whether that be sophisticated pivots or drip irrigation types. We found that the pivots are more functional and more reliable. And so we have a grant program where we'll split costs for moving away from flood irrigation. We also have some leak detection grant opportunities, and those are available to entities that use Edwards water. That's kind of where we play in the conservation world.
Okay. So it's a macro approach. Okay.
Well, then going back to the land conservation work that you guys are doing, as I understand it, you're also assessing different practices to capture water from the land, to harvest more water from the land. Can you tell us about those?
Sure. So, the city's EAPP program, which is the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program, utilizes a straight-up easement to help provide both water quality and water quantity conservation. What we're exploring is trying to find a better way to maximize that conservation. So in an ideal world, what we'd like to see is a conservation easement that is in place, but that also allows for the implementation of land management practices. And this is natural infrastructure that'll help hold water on the piece of property. And that does a couple of things. It helps the property itself. It helps mitigate against floods. But we are interested in maximizing what we call discrete, I think is the right word for it. I'm an English major. I'm not a technical advisor, but it's the recharge that occurs on the land, not in the creek beds. When you typically think about recharge, it's going into the dry creek beds and it's disappearing at some point in time into the ground. But a significant amount of recharge also occurs on the property itself. There's fractures within there. There's faults within there, and we would like to maximize that. If we have an extended drought, that area is extremely dry, and it has to be refilled before it ever starts recharging again. So we would like to explore the opportunities for these land management practices, think berms and swells, to hold water on the land longer so that those areas don't become completely empty of water and they fill back up faster once a drought breaks, so that we can maximize that recharge in those areas. So essentially what we'd like to do is protect historic recharge and find ways to enhance the property where maybe you can add a little more recharge from those pieces of property. We're trying to quantify that right now. There's anecdotal evidence that those are all good practices and it helps. And we know it helps with flood mitigation, and we know that it helps with water quality because you don't get as much sediment into the stream beds. But we need to prove out really what happens from a recharge perspective. And so that's what we're studying. If we can get to the point where we can quantify it, I think that we have a real marketable program, and I think it can do a lot for the region.
Mark, do you have partners out there that you're playing with? A lot of the stuff that you're talking about, I'm thinking USDA programs.
We do, and we're continuing to try to grow those. Just to kind of pull the curtain back, we started implementing these programs a couple of years ago. To be frank, we have a mission to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards. We feel like we've accomplished the management perspective. We've implemented all our permitting programs, but we need to focus on the protecting and enhancing. And so we're calling it a next generation initiative. It's really for the next generation of aquifer users and for the next generation that lives in this region. And so we're trying to develop those partnerships. We've got some partnerships right now with UTSA to do some of these studies, and we're continuing to try to grow that research. And we're also trying to do more partnerships. And historically, because we're a governmental organization, we have a lot of intergovernmental relationships, but we're trying to expand those relationships into more foundations, more nonprofits, just simply other entities that have an overlapping interest that we do. We don't have to match interest, and we don't have to agree on every issue, but in the Venn diagram of interest, if there's an overlap, we'd like to partner with you to try to facilitate some success and some positive movement in those areas.
From the political side, can you give us any idea of how your board interacts with SAW's board and what those relationships might look like in terms of the ability to do wholesale water or do the CNs, that sort of thing? Is that going to end up coming to a head, or is there an influence there?
I think our board speaks with, I think the EAA-SAWS relationship is complicated. I think we regulate SAWS, but we're also partners with SAWS. And so there's always an open line of communication between the two organizations. There are 7 Bexar County directors out of 15 voting members on our board. So anytime there are decisions made from a political standpoint, there has to be a compromise between regional interests in order to pass something before our board. I think in the past, the Edwards has always been willing to help SAWS address issues, but it also has to balance with the concerns and the interests with the rest of our elected officials. So I think we have an open relationship. I think we've been more open to partnerships over the past 10 years than maybe there was in the initial conception of the Edwards when permits were getting issued. So I know that's not a very good answer to your question, but that's probably the best I can give you right now. The dialogue can take place, but there's a lot of moving parts.
Okay.
From a legislative standpoint, do you guys ever consider concepts, obviously the authority area ends at the Kendall County border because of jurisdictional boundaries, of course. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, given that you are so intimately tied to the contributing zone, the water supply is, do you ever consider or work on legislation to help influence development practices over the rest of the contributing zone or even the density of development, potentially? Yeah,
I mean, that's a complicated question. And, we don't have direct land use regulatory powers. We have some powers for regulation over land use in a way in that we regulate the storage and use of regulated materials on the recharge zone and in portions of the contributing zone, but we don't have the power to tell someone how to develop that land. We're supportive of responsible development, whatever that means, but from a perspective where we don't want it to negatively impact recharge, we're supportive of that. I don't know how far out we would go into getting into the regulatory world of that. We'd support the state of Texas having the tools that they need to do their jobs. I don't think the Edwards would be interested in taking on that role simply because we have so many irons in the fire as it is. But we're supportive of responsible development. We're supportive of good planning. And so I guess the best way for me to answer that question would be that. Fair enough.
All right. Any other questions? Additional thoughts? Mark, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to share this with us. We're going to move on. This morning, is this Todd? Todd? Tom, I'm sorry. That's what happens when you put me in charge of a keyboard. Tom Hodge is going to talk to us a little bit about San Jose Water and what you guys are doing.
Hello, thank you for having me. First time here. I'm get familiar with everyone. As you know, the actual company name is SJWTX Inc., which does business as Canyon Lake Water Service Company, and it's been in Texas since 2005, actually. I am the president of that organization. We've been providing water and more recently wastewater service in Comal County, like I said, since about 2005 when we acquired the Canyon Lake Water Supply Corporation. And as you've probably heard, and why I'm here is we've recently, as of December, acquired what was known as Kendall West Utilities, which serves the Ranger Creek and Tapatio development. I don't have, as it's a fairly recent acquisition, I don't have a very detailed presentation on our water supply plan. It's something we're developing. I would tell you a little bit about what we've done over the years in Comal County to give you kind of a sense of the approach we take. Since actually before 2005, the Water Supply Corporation was doing the same thing. In Comal County, and this is maybe something that Kendall County could consider as an approach for water supply planning. They have adopted a regulation that basically requires any new development to provide a water availability report which would show a long-term water supply to serve out the new development. If the developer themselves don't want to do that, and if they want to connect with a larger utility, for instance, us or New Braunfels Utility or Garden Ridge, then they have to get a letter of water availability from that utility. And the way it's then regulated is the county engineer's office reviews a report that we as the utility provide the county to show that we have that supply, and we've done that planning, and that report has to be updated every 3 years. We're actually in the process of updating that right now. It's due for renewal by the end of this year. We've already got draft internal reports, but not ready to share them. But we've been doing that planning for Comal County, like I said. And in fact, I'm a water resource engineer by training myself. So the first few reports, I did them myself, but we've grown. I now have staff to do that for me. And it's very detailed. We have sources of supply with contracted from GBRA, from Canyon Lake. We do not currently use any Edwards water, I'll tell you that. Our service area is just outside the Edwards Aquifer region. We do overlap with it, but it's in an area where the Edwards really wouldn't produce much water. We're kind of more in the recharge zone, western half of the county, pretty much from Canyon Lake to Bulverde. And so we have something about 6,900 acre feet of water currently under contract with GBRA for, actually that's prior to our acquisition of Kendall West. We also got 750 that came with the acquisition. So that puts us over 7,500 total contracted water supply with GBRA. We also have over 70 wells in the Trinity. Many of these wells were drilled back when, in days when they weren't really using surface water. So we have a lot of those wells. Many of them are inactive right now. We have about 35 or 40 that are active. I'm looking at my chief of operations here. I think it's over 35 Trinity wells, and they vary. The Trinity is not nearly as prolific as the Edwards, as you all know, but in places we have some very productive Trinity wells. Generally for us, the obstacle with that is they were drilled in places where they were just intended to serve a small subdivision or something like that. And what we've been doing is going back, and these were ones we acquired as we've acquired other utilities. So besides the original purchase of Canyon Lake Water Supply, we've done 15 subsequent acquisitions, with Kendall West being one of the most recent. Most of those others were in Comal County. They were adjacent systems. So what we've done is take an approach of regionalizing the water systems in Comal County, and I could see us doing that to some extent in Kendall County. We have some service in Blanco and Hayes County also. But the advantage of that is by interconnecting all these different disparate water systems, we can take the systems that have maybe inadequate water supply and supplement them by interconnecting with our regional system, where we can now bring them surface water. And or in some cases, we've acquired some utilities. One we did just a year ago, 200 homes. They had wells that could do 600 gallons a minute. That's well in excess of what they needed. It allowed us to then extend that water supply and bring it back into the regional system and support other parts of our system. It's a complicated and long-term project because generally, when we're acquiring something, if we acquire something like that has a excess water supply, well, they didn't build the pipeline infrastructure with the intent of delivering that water out to the regional system. So that means we now have to build additional pipelines, pump stations, and storage tanks. And we've got a lot of projects like that going on. In fact, our capital budget alone for capital improvements for this year was over $24 million of investment. And we've been trending upward every year. We've been over $20 million a year for several years. So we are investing a lot in the infrastructure and water supply, and also with concern for water quality, improving water treatment processes, and then in some cases, some of the wells or sources, particularly some of the wells, maybe the water quality was not adequate. We've had to actually abandon or plug some wells because that high sulfates or phosphate or fluorides is a common problem. So it's a regional approach to water supply. planning. We have staff, in fact, one of my staff, the manager of compliance, who oversees some of our water conservation and water supply planning. She's on the call. She's listening in. Chelsea Hawkins, you may hear from her at some point. It's a process that is ongoing, and I intend to, share more information with this committee as we develop it and develop our plans for Kendall County as well, and we complete the ones that we've done for Comal County. Just one other thing I'm going to say, because there's always an interest in water conservation. That's something I think, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, as we experience the rapid growth in Comal County. And just for example, in 2006, when we actually closed on that acquisition of Canyon Lake water system, there were 7,000 meters. We're over 24,000 now. So that's pretty rapid, pretty extensive growth, and it's been growing, actually accelerating in recent years. There's rapid growth. So we definitely recognize the need to work with our partners like GBRA. We've had talks with SAWS and other neighboring utilities, and developing new water supplies. And we're actively pursuing multiple pathways to develop additional water supplies, which again, by the end of this year, we'll be able to share a lot more information about that as we develop those plans more thoroughly. But as far as water conservation, one thing we've done because of all this rapid growth is begun to include in our contracts with new development requirements for water conservation on the part of the developer. We cooperate with them. We're not a government entity, so we can't just pass a regulation. We do have a drought plan. We have a water conservation plan. Those are public documents. They're available on our website. But we can't just pass an ordinance, right? So when we partner with the development, we've been including more and more requirements that they do things that would encourage conservation. For example, we now require that a developer, if they have a new home development, that their model homes include xeriscaping. And that way, when people move into that neighborhood, they see that as the standard for that area. And they consider that at least. We can't force them to do it. We do ask them to include some restrictions in their CCRs that would limit the amount of irrigated landscaping, spray irrigation, at least to on the order of 4,000 or 5,000 square feet of lawn. So if somebody has a 1 acre lot, which we did find when we came to Canyon Lake, and some of the neighborhoods around the lake, they just didn't have that restriction, and people just felt like it was perfectly fine. We got a lake nearby, let's just irrigate my whole 2 acre lot. that we just don't find that sustainable as we're growing. So we're doing all we can within the legal constraints we operate under to encourage conservation. So, any questions?
I'm sure there are several.
You go first. Go ahead.
Tom?
No, it's okay. I'm still gathering thoughts.
Yeah, I am kind of too. But I guess, so from a legal standpoint, I'm just kind of curious about your pricing and if you wanted to adjust pricing. So oftentimes, one of the findings, of course, we found is that increasing the price of water, while it's not great for consumers, also does oftentimes drive conservation outcomes.
Sure does.
And I'm just kind of curious how you guys...
Yeah, we have a tiered pricing structure, an escalated tiered pricing structure in our Canyon Lake rates. Now, we can't just go out and change the rates that we just, when we acquire something like the Kendall West utility, we inherit their pricing structure until such time that we go in for a major rate case, which is not something we like to do very often because it's very contentious and expensive to go through. But their water rate actually is pretty high. I mean, the Kendall West utility, because the cost of water is high, they rely highly on the Western Canyon Project water, which, for us, that's in the Canyon Lake area, we use some of that, but it only represents less than 10% of our supply, but it's our most expensive. Whereas at Kendall West, it's something like 50% of their supply. So therefore, they do actually have fairly high volumetric rates in the Kendall County, which we then inherit and maintain those. So I do see, and we're just now kind of analyzing some of the data that, the average monthly consumption as we're going into the summer is not in much of our service area here is actually even lower than much of our service area in Comal County. But yes, with the last time we filed for a rate increase in Comal County was 2014, And that and even prior cases that we had filed, we implemented a more drastic tiered rate structure so that customers using over 10,000 or 25,000 gallons a month have significantly higher rates for that higher volumetric usage. And that does help us in that regard. And for me, from a water management point of view, some utilities might just look at it like, oh, well, they want customers to use water because it increases their revenue. But for us as well, if you're only selling that water for 3 or 4 months of the year, but you have to build all the infrastructure to meet that peak demand, that's not a good proposition, actually. It's better to be able to serve a wider population with a more steady demand year-round as much as possible. There's always going to be some seasonal variation, but so we do our best both through pricing and through these measures I mentioned about in our contracting to encourage conservation.
So one of the issues that I hear a lot locally, and I think it's actually one of the motivators for Bernie considering increasing its water supply is development in the sort of Wild West development in the county, the lack of ability to influence that without having some other hook, like being able to provide water and therefore driving it toward a development agreement. It sounds like you guys are limited in terms of what you can ask of a developer. But I know, like in Bernie, for example, we've got some great stormwater requirements, so there's really high-quality water coming off the landscape going forward, is what we'll see. They've had to adjust some things for various reasons, but it's all going well, I think, and fair. And I guess so, I guess my question becomes then, are there additional options for you guys to encourage better quality development? And I'm not talking about that. I mean,
well, we're primarily a water and wastewater utility. I mean, stormwater, we really don't have any involvement in. But there are, if this is in the Edwards recharge zone or contributing zone, they still have to comply with the regulations, that apply to those areas. But we're just not the body to be able to really regulate them on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hear that, but I guess you are also still beneficiaries or subject to the negative consequences.
Yeah, for our facilities, we obviously have to comply with those rules too, for our own facilities. But.
Well, I'm not saying legally you may not be able to do it. I guess I'm just saying that the water quality does ending up in the tap, right? If it's low quality water,
right. I mean, for like surface runoff and things like
right.
that. Yeah, right. But my understanding is that the TCQ does and the local districts do have regulations in place for that. You just don't feel they're adequate. Okay, I understand.
Yeah, definitely not.
Okay.
And Tom, I apologize for getting your name incorrect. I apologize for that.
No, it's a problem.
I have a variety of questions, and these are in no particular order. So if one should have been in front of another one, just say, hey, you're better off asking this question this way.
Okay.
One thing we didn't talk much about, but is something we're going to be talking more about here, and I'm interested in what you guys are doing about it in terms of wastewater. Obviously, you have basic requirements for processing your wastewater, but are there any plans for future use of that wastewater other than simple discharge? Are you talking about reclamation of that water, and if so, what does that look like from your standpoint?
Yeah, so currently there's a couple things going on, at least in Kendall County. I mean, in Comal County, we do operate several small wastewater plants. One of them discharges to a pond that's then used by the river crossing golf course. It's 100% irrigation water. We have a couple of our land application permits. We have some interim agreements with the city of Bernie. There's a development happening right near 46 and I-10 on Spencer Ranch, where we're actually just bid a contract to basically send the effluent to the Bernie system, and they'll go to their plant. There's a term to that. Longer term, we have a permit that is going through final review at the TCQ. It's at the administrative law judge. We're waiting for their final ruling. There's a draft permit issued to take the permit that's at the Tapatio Golf Course and increase that from 150,000 gallons a day to I think it's 490,000 gallons a day. And there are a couple projects for that. Now, the agreement with the golf courses, they fully intend to, use that effort. Currently, under the existing plant, they are only able to irrigate a couple fairways with that water. So they fully intend to use that for expand their landscape irrigation. But we did make that permit is a change from what's called a land application permit, which is basically you're designating a specific area that you're going to irrigate and has to have restrictions on it and things under that. And it's those specific fairways, the driving range is that's a big part of it at the Tapatio, to a discharge permit. But the reason for that is because the primary irrigation pond that the golf course uses is actually on Frederick Creek. They have a small dam on it, and they hold their water there. They currently supplement it with well water. But the intention is just to then discharge directly into that pond and allow them to irrigate it directly from that pond. And that's why it's a discharge permit instead of a land app permit. The intention is that they will still, and they have enough demand to use what we are discharging. But just because of the plumbing of it, essentially, and the way that their golf course was already set up, it's not a new golf course. We're not able to design around this. The idea is we're going to be supplementing they're providing additional water supply to the golf course. And because it's a discharge permit and it's a newer plant, it'll meet a much higher water quality standard. So it has low nitrate and phosphate, much lower BOD and TSS requirements than the existing permit does under the land app permit. So it will actually, I feel, adequately protect water quality there. And in fact, most of the water will still be used for irrigation at the golf course. Certainly, could be times in the middle of one of our 13-inch rainstorms where there's times when the golf course isn't taking that water, but at that point, any effluent we're discharging is a drop in the bucket to what's going down the creek anyway. So I feel it's adequate protection in that regard.
Okay. And for perspective, when you're looking at your service area and your client base, what percentage of those that you provide water for do you also provide wastewater services for?
You want me to limit it to Kendall County?
No, just
let's
say in the west of that.
We only have about fewer than 1,000 wastewater customers. And so, like I said, we have 24,000 water customers. Now, some of them are served by other wastewater utilities. A large proportion, probably the majority, have on-site. Much of Comal County was developed on the idea you have a 1-acre tract and you can do your own little on-site treatment system. Most of the development over the last 15, 20 years has been on that model. In more recent years, the developers are looking to go for higher density, particularly in areas like near Bulverde along I-281. There's several developments that are going in. The commercial development requires it. The high schools need it. They can't really operate without some kind of permit. And so we've seen various go in. To some extent, we don't have as much control over that because if we don't, what's called our CCN is our service area for water. In Comal County, we have a lot more leverage with developers. They pretty much have to come to us because they don't have an adequate source of water otherwise. But if they're going to do a development and do the wastewater plant, basically our tariff would require us to make them, if they're doing it just for their development, they basically have to pay for it all anyway. And so what they often look for is a way that they can get some kind of reimbursement from that. So they did an agreement, if you're familiar with Singing Hills, it's where the Walmart is in Bulverde. They did an agreement with the city of Bulverde where they basically had a district created, fund the infrastructure to build the wastewater plant, essentially get dedicated to the city then not contract with GBRA to operate it. So that was a way that then they could impose a property tax on the development and get some reimbursement. Because when you do wastewater, the infrastructure costs really go up. I mean, on a per customer basis, they're easily twice what they are for water and much more for any other utility. I mean, water is already on a per customer basis up 2 or 3 times at least what it costs to bring electricity to your home. But bringing municipal or city water to It's a pretty significant capital investment, but often they can just recover that through the sale of the lot. But once they start doing higher density with higher density roads, other utilities, sometimes underground utilities, and wastewater, the cost per home or per lot gets much higher. And just, the model in Texas, just, thank the legislature for that, it makes it very easy for them to set up special districts that then they can get a reimbursement through. So many of the developers we've worked with have kind of gone that route for their wastewater, and so we're not actually the wastewater utility. We are in some places, though.
Okay, so they're basically creating a district and going through that process. Are you seeing that, other than just creating the bare minimum, are you seeing folks doing anything to do reclaimed water like what you're doing at Tapatio, or find some mechanism to use that water?
It is more common. I think it's becoming more accepted. I mean, 10 years ago, there's sort of it's worth the effort. But Singing Hills, for instance, they have a recycled water system to at least the commercial lots. A lot of people often misunderstand, though. If you look at the water balance on an annual basis, it looks like, well, you can recycle your wastewater and use it for irrigation. The problem is your irrigation needs in most areas in the summer are much higher than the amount of wastewater effluent you would actually get, at the time you need it. Unless you have someplace to store it from the winter to the summer, you're not going to be able to do that on a kind of almost a closed loop type thing. But they did find, like at Singing Hills, that there was enough, they could basically make all the commercial developers any of their landscape irrigation. They do it, they build a purple pipe distribution system, and we actually have 2 meters to read for each one of those customers. Other places, Meyer Ranch, which is off 46 outside New Braunfels, we're the water utility. They have a separate sewer utility. They did do quite a bit of landscape irrigation with their effluent. I don't know if they're using 100% of their effluent because, again, we're not operating that sewer system. But I know they have a pretty extensive irrigation system for their public amenity facilities, their parks. I think they have a soccer field or something like that. So a lot of them are doing that, and it's pretty natural. Almost everywhere you see a golf course in Texas, it's almost always on wastewater effluent. So, like River Crossing, they get some effluent from us.
You mentioned that you guys are doing a ton of infrastructure work, and it makes sense because you're connecting somewhat smaller, somewhat larger, and you're trying to get a balance and a harmony, which probably, we've talked about that here as maybe making some sense on a grander scale, to be able to push water from where it is into where it needs to be, even among neighbors. That's kind of different than what a historical approach has been. But I'm interested in learning, and you may not be in a position to talk about this today, but I'd like to know kind of what your future projects are in that connection. And I also understood from GBR's presentation that there's going to be an opportunity to pick up water over in the 35 corridor. That's a new source. And have you spoken to other friends and neighbors about trying to put infrastructure in place where that might be something that could be shared amongst people out in our neck of the woods? There's a couple projects. There's one in particular that could generate several thousand acre feet a year, but we're literally in final stages of negotiation, so I don't want to bring them up. I'm hopeful that'll go through and close in a year or so. We've been in close communication with GBRA on that and on the projects that you're talking about. And we're kind of a linchpin there for them because if they can get it to I-35 and we could either interconnect with NBU or one of the other neighboring utilities, we're very close to NBU right now, that we could wheel water through our infrastructure in Comal County. And currently, like I said, we've acquired some 15 systems, and literally in Comal County, if all those systems were still in place, it would amount to over 30 public water systems. A public water system being a standalone water system. We've interconnected them enough now that we're down to, 8 or 9? In Comal County, and we're constantly in the process of doing that. We have pipelines and plans to connect. We have our systems primarily now divided between 2 large systems, kind of the north and west side of the lake and the south side of the lake. We're only about a mile apart now, so the plan is to connect those both on both the northeast and the southwest side of the lake. So we'll essentially have pipelines all the way around the lake, probably within 5 years.
And that allows us to then take a source from any direction and distribute it in any other direction. And of course, when you look at, I mean, because it's not just Kendall County, Blanco County relies on us too. We wholesale to the city of Blanco. They rely on us as their backup to the Blanco River, which is prone to dry up. It doesn't have any storage on it. So we are a supplier to them. And so they've asked us to kind of factor them into their future planning too, because as we develop additional supplies, we're trying to help them. And then we're also in a position where if we can bring water from I-35, either connecting the NBU or directly from some infrastructure that GBRA builds, we could wheel that water to customers to the north and west. We are factoring that into our sort of like pipe sizing as we build new pipes and things.
The next question is really, this is multifaceted, but I'm going to try to throw a lot of things at you because I think they're so interconnected, it may make it easier for you to respond.
Sure.
Because you're talking to GBRA, because your service area both is growing from a geographic standpoint and the density is increasing, I think that's a given. At what rate, I have no idea. And I assume that that's something you guys are working on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah.
But as you look at that and you talk about what your own needs are and realize that you're in a position to wheel water to neighbors, what capacity are you at accounting for your own future needs and your ability to be a source or to be a vehicle for other folks source water? In other words, it's great if you have all this in place, but if you don't have if the pipe's not big enough, how are you going to help other people service it? And I'm assuming that you've got the ability because you already have the land, so you can go back in and put bigger pipe in, but that takes time, that takes money. So I'm just wondering if you can sketch out your situation and how you see that developing over the near term and over the longer term.
Yeah, well, so since there's still a fair amount of uncertainty as to exactly where will the new water come into our system, I mean, one factor out there is greater utilization of Canyon Lake within the basin. I mean, it's fully allocated, but everyone knows SAWS has a contract, and they're currently using some 7 million gallons a day out of the Western Canyon project, even beyond what their minimum their contract says. So I think there's the opportunity to keep to utilize more of that as we build some of this other infrastructure and make these other plans. I think that that can buy us a couple of years there, just as the contractors on the Western Canyon project use more and more of their allocation, which we're one of them, and Bernie's one of them. All of us will be using more of that, of what we've already been paying for, really. Like for example, Kendall West, they're only using about 240 acre feet of the 750 that they had under contract. We've told them, look, we'll use some of that water throughout our service area. We'll pay for it. We'll use it as we're building other infrastructure to bring in the newer water supplies. But yeah, I think the key is to build these links and not. The one problem with Western Canyon is it's basically one pipeline. And so you build it to that size. Now, the advantage of operating a retail system in conjunction with building transmission facilities is we have the ability to have multiple pathways. So as new developments are happening, like I said, where we relied for years to supply Bulverde through a 16-inch transmission main that goes all the way from the north side of the lake to 281 south of Bulverde. It's like 36 miles of pipe just from the treatment plant to the end of the pipe. If we had a break on that pipe, it was an emergency. You were out of water, and we had very limited storage. So how do we build resiliency? We have one new 750,000 gallon storage tank just finished on Blanco Road, near Blanco Road and 46. We have another one under construction in our 281 and 1863. Additional storage, but then also interconnecting our different sources at different points. So another project, we currently serve Smithson Valley High School from the south side of the lake. We have a treatment plant, and some of our best producing wells are on the south side of Canyon Lake. We have excess capacity there. Once we connect Smithson Valley High School to some of the developments in Bulverde, we'll have a second pathway into Bulverde. And so that adds a lot of capacity. It also then relieves capacity on our pipeline 281 because now we're supplying it from the south instead of from the north, and we can actually redirect water further north, like to help Blanco, for instance. So by building multiple pathways as the development occurs and making sure that we size the pipes with excess capacity, you really build a lot of resiliency into the system. And also more connections to GBRA so that we have a backup. So we can take water from GBRA at 4 locations now. Just a few years ago, we only had 1 delivery point. And so now we can take delivery at multiple points. So if we have a disruption or a sudden burst of growth in one area, which seems to be happening, particularly in Bulverde, we have the ability to draw more of that contract that we have with GBRA and bring it to the place where it's needed most. And then buys us time to build more infrastructure to backfill it with these other newer supplies. So I think we'll need more conversations with the GBRA and understand their plans for that project. I'll let you know that the project that GBRA is partnering with Alliance on now, it's called the first phase of the Mid-Basin project. I think they still call it that. Those water rights that they acquired, we actually sold to them. We had started developing that project back in about 2008 or 9 by securing leases and contracts with landowners who were clear over in Potable County. We were thinking of developing it ourselves and using that as a future water supply. We realized GBRA is in a better position to do that because they have all these other partnership agreements with partners in between. And so we ended up selling that to them about 5 years ago. And now that's the first part of the project they're developing, the first 15,000 acre feet of groundwater that they're developing from the creeks. That was actually a project we sold to GBRA. So we do have a long history of working with them and just working with them in a way that is we don't have to own everything. We can partner with them and say this is a project that makes sense for the public agency to do, and maybe this is a project that makes more sense for us to do.
On your planning, and I know I'm sure, as in any other business, you're always forecasting and doing it in a variety of different ways. Mm-hmm. But I understood that you have a report that you guys generate every 3 years for basically a needs-based report. Mm-hmm. And then I'm assuming that you're probably forecasting longer than that. Yeah. To the extent that you're able to share those, are you willing to share some of that information?
Is there a link to it on our website? At least the last one that was approved by the county. Once it gets approved by the county, and the last update was in 2019. I think we linked to it on our website. If not, I'll make sure we do.
Not looking for proprietary.
The county requires a 20-year plan, but once I started doing it, I was like, well, look, let's align with the Water Development Board planning process. I mean, let's make it. We'll at least do projections out 50-year, and include that as some of the supplemental information with the report that the county requires of us.
And it sounded like you're doing another study, and I don't know if it's tied to the additional work the GBRA is talking about, or if it's just a holistic approach or whatever, but it sounded like you're doing another study for what does the future look like in the longer term, and maybe even in the near term, and if there is a need to try to tap into additional sources.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What are your needs based? I think it's what Daryl was talking about from GBRA, is everybody kind of needs to take a look at their house and see what do you need so that you can figure out whether you're going to be able to collaborate together and try to go get resources to be shared. And I'm just mostly interested right now is where are you guys in that process, and when do you think you'll have a result?
Well, the reports that we started updating last year before we acquired the Kendall West utility was, again, focused more on Comal County, and so we will. That's an internal draft right now, and we hope to finalize that and submit it to the county within months. It's not due till the end of the year, so we just wanted to do that. But kind of holding off on finalizing it because of some of these other potential water supplies that we might want to include in that report that we're hopefully on the verge of contracting for, and also as we get more further along with GBRA. What I think my intention would be to do is then to essentially extend that same planning process to Comal County and include it, or Kendall County, and include that same planning. But that's really at the preliminary stages. So, it's something, we've been looking at it kind of on overview basis as far as what's the total water supplies that we have here, and if we develop additional supplies in Comal County, does that then, and it does actually then allow us to reallocate some of our Western Canyon allocations from where we're using it now in Comal County and use that and hold that in reserve for Kendall County in the future. So
it may impact your timeline for
that
investing
was the
more in
beauty of this
infrastructure.
acquisition was it's like we're all on, we're adjacent, we're close enough that our operators can help each other out, but also we both rely on Canyon Lake. And so the fact that if as GBRA or we develop these other sources of supply to support our Comal County customers or our Blanco County customers, then that can relieve demand or free up supplies, particularly from the Western Canyon project, and we can then shift that over into Kendall County.
Your sense of timing on that is?
Before the end of the year. I can't really promise anything quicker than that.
No, fair enough. Just trying to put some, there's some big blocks out there floating around and trying to figure out how they connect, and everyone's on a different schedule, and everyone has.
Unfortunately, it took us quite a while to negotiate this agreement with Kendall County. We started talking to them over 3 years ago, and we only closed last December. So, I thought it always made sense. It was just how to get it done.
So I have a couple more questions. I guess the first one's more for my education, I guess, but I'd heard that you guys had purchased all these different utilities and had inherited CCNs, but didn't necessarily have the water to supply what was needed. Is there a requirement that you supply water within your CCN or be able to?
Yeah, I mean, if we have a request for service that's in our CCN, we're obligated to serve. It's kind of what goes with it. It's it's both a need and an obligation. It's a certificate of convenience and necessity is what they call it. But like I said, I would say, when we first bought the Canyon Lake system, we made a number of, part of that acquisition was the Canyon Lake water system really didn't have the financial and managerial capacity to build it. They were at their verge of breaking down. And the county engineer told me this. He says, I'm glad that we came in. So we immediately committed to a number of capital improvements, and we did that. We upgraded the treatment plants and added a lot of capacity. And at that point, then for several years, we actually had more capacity than we needed just from the contracts we had. We also contracted for some of the last Canyon Lake water that was available before it was fully allocated. So we increased our contracts with that. So there were a number of years there where it was like, okay, we're doing our water supply planning, this water availability report, and we got a 50-year supply. It's like, so we started looking at some of these other neighboring systems that were more needy, and then some of them were coming to us because it's like, well, we got this well, but it only does 10 gallons a minute. That was fine when there were 10 homes here, but now there's 50. So, so they were often some of the easier things to acquire because they needed us. And so we went through a process of doing that. And more recent years, the ones that were kind of holding out were the ones that had plenty of water supply. And we couldn't meet their price because of that. But now that we're getting to the point where it's like, okay, we're growing so much, that 50-year water supply plan with the growth that we've had is now more like a 25 to 30-year water supply plan because, it changes a lot. If you change your growth projection from 2% a year to 3% a year, it really adds up quickly, and that's what we're seeing, so it's really, the growth has accelerated. And so it's made us accelerate some of these projects. It also made us more willing to pay a premium for a small water system like the one I mentioned a year ago. We closed on that had very good water supply. They never had a reason to sell for us before because under the valuation of just, well, what's that 200 customers going to do to us, we couldn't pay them a price that they were willing to sell at. But now that we know that the water supply, they have the extra water supply and we need it, we can say, okay, we'll pay you a premium for that. And then we were able to reach an agreement. So that's kind of where it's come out. So again, it's balancing. It's like the last few acquisitions, that one particular and the next couple of ones that I'm negotiating now, actually bring us additional water supply. They were the ones that were holding out for a higher price because they had all the water they needed.
But I guess what I was trying to get at, is that it sounds like there's also a need to balance the CCN with the water supply.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and we're done. I mean, it's not like we're just annexed anything. I mean, we got to make sure we conserve it, you know. We've definitely turned down development. I'll tell you that if that's what you're asking, because there's definitely some places where we just tell people it's either the water's not there or it's not economically feasible for your project, you know.
So kind of going back to what Mark Freiberg was talking about with Edwards Aquifer Authority, understanding that the contributing zone plays into groundwater recharge, I certainly think it also plays into surface water recharge and surface water quality. And it goes back to, again, my earlier question, which is kind of along the lines of, having better development. And so I understand, you're likely to probably join in legislative efforts to perhaps make Edwards Aquifer water more accessible in different regions. I could envision that you guys would be supportive of that. Yes, no?
Yeah, I mean, up to this point, it really hasn't affected us that much because we're not really connected to Edwards. But I think when SAWS has approached us, recently, because that bill that the governor vetoed, that would have allowed some flexibility, particularly with the issue of, it's like, well, is the water really, even if it's only 5% Edwards water, it's, 95% Vista Ridge or Trinity water, why can't they send that across the county? And if nothing else, it would at least allow us to build that reliability, because one thing we like to do is interconnect with neighboring utilities, even if it's not tied to a water supply contract, just as an emergency interconnect, so that, and we're talking to NBU about that. It's just like, okay, let's have a place where, as we grow closer together, where we can interconnect. So if you have a pipe failure, because at the hardest places to serve a water utility are at the extreme ends, because then you don't really have those looped mains. I mean, if you're in the central core of your service area, you often have multiple sources and multiple ways to get water there. But at the fringes of your service area, that's where you often have the catastrophic failure. One main break can put out hundreds of customers out of water. Well, if you have an interconnect with a neighboring utility, they can help you out if that happens to you, or vice versa. So we've had discussions with, NBU's the most obvious because they're right next to us and we don't have that restriction, but we'd like to do that with SAWS too.
So I'm just sort of lobbing a Hail Mary on this one, but I'm just wondering if there's any chance that you guys would be supportive of legislation that would allow local governments, county governments, to have better stormwater quality and management requirements. And the reason I ask that,
I wouldn't oppose it
because slow it down, sink it in, as well as filter it. And,
it certainly wouldn't see. I mean, we'd have to look at the specifics, but on the principle, I certainly don't see any reason why we would oppose something like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Any other questions? Anyone on the call? I don't see anyone. Tom, thank you so much. It's been very informative, and I hope we can have you back and maybe you can help us fill in some more gaps.
Thank you.
We're going to have more questions.
Thank you for the opportunity. And if any of you want to follow up, one-on-one, feel free to call me. I'll leave my information. Okay.
Great. Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. All right, our own beloved Mr. Mann.
How are you guys doing?
Groovy.
I apologize for my voice. I've got a sinus thing going on, so I actually sound like more of a man today than I usually do. I gave this presentation to City Council a couple of months ago, and I'm going to fast forward through the wastewater part of it, but I did want to focus on the water. This is really a snapshot of where we are right now, how things are developing, and how we plan to serve in the near future. And of course, the committee knows its role with the long term, but in the near future, just to show you that we're in better shape than a lot of people really think we are. So let me go through these slides. And Mike, do you have to advance it? I'm sorry? Yeah, they're not working. Maybe I can use your wireless mouse. There we go. Okay, I'm going to get past the wastewater stuff and start on water. Thank you. So where do we serve right now? Well, since the 1950s, the city of Bernie has had a policy that it only served inside the city limits, and it was a tool that we used to basically control, zone things that cities have the power to do. And Tom talked a little bit about it, but we were the only game in town. Well, we're not anymore, and so we're having to change our approach and the way we think. And so we have made agreements to go out and serve some other WCIDs, water control and improvement districts outside of us, and we got a lot of opportunity out of that. We were with Esperanza, WCID, Kendall County WCID number 2. We were able to develop our reclaimed water system, and we have a large-scale dual water system, that'll ultimately have at least 3,500 connections on it, and I'll show you the benefits of that in a minute. Same developer has created WCID number 4, also known as George's Ranch, and we have a development agreement to serve them. So instead of just the city limits now, we are serving outside in some areas where council has deemed it beneficial to the city. From a supply standpoint, what are our supplies? And it's hard to see this map, but what the intent of it is, these are the wells that we have in town, and what you'll see are some purple ones and some blue ones. The purple ones are the ones that we just don't use anymore. They are either non-productive or have their production has dropped off so much that they're just inactive. Many of them have been abandoned. We have some that are in strata of the Trinity that are just not productive anymore, like the one behind the old city hall and things out in there. So we just recently abandoned that one when we moved out of City Hall. We also have our water treatment plant out at Bernie City Lake. The water in the lake is owned by the state of Texas, just as the water in the Canyon Lake is owned by the state of Texas. And all utilities that pull out of it have to have a permit from the state, and the amount that we can take is capped by the state. And it's it's not supposedly, it is firm, and it is based on the amount of water that would be available in a repeated drought of record. So there's millions and millions and millions of gallons out there. We can only pull out so much in any one year, and that is supposed to be a sustainable amount based on the best calculations we can do. So what are our supplies? City Lake, our permit from TCEQ, the total amount we can pull out is 833 acre feet per year. That works out to an average of 743,000 and some change gallons per day. The big issue, and you'll hear this word out of my mouth a lot, is how much can we peak? How much can we serve in one day? And the most that we can make out of that plant, produce out of that plant out of a day, and treat and produce is 1 million to 1.5 million gallons per day right now, as it was designed and built in the 1970s. Meets our needs right now. Will need to be expanded at some point. What's important to understand is that if we expand the plant, it's just to be able to serve more in a day. We can't get more out of the lake in total. So instead of serving all year long in a smaller amount, we would serve in a more concise time period in a larger amount per day. I'm going to go in a particular order here. For years, before we had City Lake, our only source of water from a utility standpoint was wells, and I've already talked about those a bit. But right now we have 9 active wells. Our permit, the amount that we can pull out of the ground from our Cow Creek Groundwater Conservation District permit, is a maximum of 1,850 acre feet per year. That works out to an average of 1.65 million gallons a day. The big number is how much peaking capacity do we have. And that is our most volatile source. Everybody that's been up here today talked about the influence of weather on well water availability. And honestly, it's easy it's almost automatic for us to comply with Cow Creek's restrictions, because the water is just not available when we go into restrictions. So the well water that we can pump on an individual basis drops as the water level over the pump drops. And so those wells become less productive. In a repeat of the drought of record, we might not be able to get more than 0.1 million gallons a day out of there, as opposed to the 2.2 maximum that we could take from if all those wells were at full production. So that's a very volatile source, and it has to do with how much we could peak. So for years, the city of Bernie was groundwater only. When they built the lake in the 70s, it became about a half and half surface water and groundwater system. Move on into GBRA, the water that became available to us in the early 2000s under contract, the same water that most of our neighbors are using. Under the Western Canyon project, our max contract under the Western Canyon project is 3,611 acre feet per year. That equates to a maximum and actually a constant flow of 3.2 million gallons per day. What's unique about our permit or our agreement with GBRA is that it's a constant flow 24/7. And we can ratchet up how much we buy from GBRA any one year, but we can never go down. So if we decide we're going to buy more, we are committed to buying that every year. From a cost standpoint, groundwater, about 50 cents a thousand. I'm just going to give you round numbers, and it's all in how you approach it. But about 50 cents per 1,000 gallons to produce. Lake water, probably about $1.50. It just costs more to treat it. We've got the plant. There's a lot more to do, about $1.50 a thousand. GBRA's water costs us about $3 per thousand. So Tom talked about that being the most expensive water we have. It is. So if you average our two, we were 50-50 before. It was about $1 a thousand. GBRA's water is about $3. So from a rate standpoint, it behooves us to buy as little as we can every year and manage our peak and try to make sure that we've got health and human needs taken care of in our base flow from GBRA and then peak off of our other sources. So that's where reclaimed water comes in. When we started talking to WCI, a different developer than actually ended up developing it, but basically Esperanza way back in the 2000s. They had a contract with GBRA to buy water, but it's a constant flow contract, and they couldn't peak for themselves. So they asked us to be their water supply, and we told them we can do it, but you need to put in a dual water system, and so that we can serve you with reclaimed water. Now, we have the benefit of having a lot of flow into that plant that doesn't just come from Esperanza, so we have more supply from the overall city than we have just from that development, so it works from a water balance standpoint. And we were able to create that utility, and it's starting to pay big benefits in terms of potable water conservation. We expanded into a neighboring development, and when we're providing reclaimed water in the ranches at Creekside as well. Again, in total, probably 3,500 houses, maybe out of 10,000 that we'll have in a couple of decades. That's a significant number of houses that are not irrigating with potable water. Landscape irrigation is our primary peak. We probably get a little bit more peak out of some commercial restaurants, swimming pool refills, but the majority of our peak is landscape irrigation. So what does if we were to serve 100%, and there's a lot of assumptions in this graph, and I think the colors are pretty, but a lot of assumptions in this graph. And so in round numbers, if we average about 150 gallons per capita per day, and we have a total population of 35,000 people, this graph is created by basically a slice. One slice of the graph is 1 day. And so it goes from the beginning of January to the end of December. This is our model. It's never this pretty. It never looks this uniform, but it's a bell curve. And so you can see that the majority of our peak, and this is based on historical data, the majority of our peak comes between April and October, November. That's when we have to produce more, and it's not too far of a stretch to figure out where most of that water is going. And it's going primarily on landscape. So if we look at realistic availability and how much we can buy out of our firm supplies and how much we can produce, that equates to about 35,000 gallons of population if we were able to peak from the resources that we have in some reasonable year, not a wet year and not the drought of record, but somewhere in between. And the blue slice in the middle, that's the groundwater availability. And so if that disappeared because we were in a repeat of the drought of record, our ace in the hole is to implement restrictions such that lawns could die. But we do have plenty of water for human needs, and that's met primarily through our contract with GBRA. So we have plenty of water for human needs. What we struggle with when it's really dry, just like everybody else around us, is landscape irrigation availability. That's why we have restrictions, not because we don't have enough in total, but because we struggle during dry periods to produce enough in a day. We could go buy more GBRA water, but it's expensive. Now, I talked about the mix that we had before GBRA was about $1 per thousand total between the two. And GBRA's Western Canyon water is about $3 per thousand. I would suspect that any new resource is going to cost closer to $9 or $10 per thousand. So whereas Western Canyon was triple what we were seeing, our next supplies are probably triple that. And it's primarily not the cost of producing the water, it's the cost of transporting the water. Tom talked about pipelines and regional supplies, and I couldn't agree anymore. It's about how you get it from point A to point B and who pays for it. We're a relatively small utility, so for us to go spend $50 million on a pipeline is tough for us to do. A little bit of history. So you saw the pretty graph, the one that is the one that is the model. Well, this is a little more realistic. And so 2020, we had that midsummer peak like you saw on the previous model. But what you can see is there's a lot of periods where it really dropped low, and what that is rain days. And so our customers are good enough to us and concerned enough about their pocketbooks to where when they can stop watering their landscape, they typically do. They stay green because of the rain, and our customers respond. Their yards stay green, and they respond by minimizing the amount of water we have to produce. 2021 was a really wet year. We got a lot of repetitive rains. You know, in a perfect world, we get an inch per week uniformly, and we don't have any kind of irrigation peak at all because that Mother Nature provides for the landscape. It's not how it normally works, but 2021 was a pretty good year. Just mentioned the spike that you see in February. That was the snowstorm, and we actually produced more potable water in a couple of days right there than we had ever produced in the middle of the summer, and it was primarily leaks. A little bit of people running water to keep their pipes from freezing, but primarily it was leaks due to the freeze. We had one big main leak and a whole lot of customer leaks, and our customers helped us conserve. We used water from storage. We were able to make it through, and our system never lost pressure. But you can see what that 1 day or 1 week did to our consumption, and that's the kind of effects that weather can have. Where are we in 2022? Well, we're a lot higher than we were in 2021, and it's no stretch of the imagination to know why. We're drier. So we had some pretty high usage, up to 4 million gallons a day. Let me talk a little bit about the numbers. In 2021, even with reclaimed water, we only touched 4 million gallons per day in the heat of the summer. We were over 4 million gallons on a potable supply, and then reclaimed as well in 2020. We were already touching 4 million gallons a day in a day in March. Then we had a little bit of cooler weather, a little bit of wetter weather, and it dropped off. But here in the last couple of weeks, it's really started to increase. And so that's why conservation is such a top of mind subject for us. The more that our customers can keep their usage in realistic terms, the better off we are as a utility. The less supplies we have to have, and the less peak we have to serve. So reclaimed water, that's talked about how big of a deal that is for us. This is not a scientific study. I picked just at random 2 houses in town of about the same size lawns, and 1 house with reclaimed water and 1 house without. And our system spit out 28 months of water consumption, and I graphed it. So the house without used 531,000 gallons over a 28-month period, 100% of that being potable. You can see, if you could read the dates at the bottom, what you'll see is that's 2.5 years or a little over 2 years. You see the summer peaks and the winter lows. So this customer didn't water landscaping during the winter, dropped really off, and then it bumped back up. 2021 was wetter than 2020, so less water use. Move over to the reclaimed water side. That customer, same size lawn, it's about the same total amount of water used at the home, but only 35% of their usage was potable, and 65% of it was reclaimed. So they watered their landscape with reclaimed water. So the more houses we get on that, the better it is overall for us. Total water production over the years has increased. The red is our surface water from City Lake and GBRA. We have dramatically increased how much surface water we use. Again, on the left side of that graph, you see our 50-50 mix before GBRA came online. After they came online, we have been primarily a surface water city. 3/4 of our water is surface water that we produce. Our groundwater actually dropped off lower than it had been historically after GBRA came online. It went up a little bit in, what is that? In the later years. But the green bar on the bottom is the reclaimed water use, and it's bumping up. Again, I don't want to dwell on the numbers too much, but we are up to about 11% of our total water produced is reclaimed water now. So what that equates to is an 11% offset in the amount of potable water we produce. Most drought and conservation plans, if you could get 11%, you're doing really, really well. So our per capita water use, the state requires that we have a water conservation plan, and we do. And how effective it is, that's a matter of looking at the numbers. In 2011, we were on about 160 gallons per capita per day. Our plan was to get down into the mid 140s, and the gray bar on top is basically showing year by year what we did from a per capita standpoint, and we did drop down into the mid 140s. Our customers have responded. We are doing good things. When you factor in how much potable water is in there, we went from 160 down to 127, which is very good compared to the industry standard and the state average. And that difference between the 127 and the 144 is, again, reclaimed water. The numbers for 2021 are really low. And again, I think that's because of the lack of landscape irrigation. We also upped our population numbers based on the new census, so that may have an effect on it, and we're still looking at that. But even our reclaimed water, if you add the blue and the orange numbers together, they come up to the gray. Even our reclaimed water dropped off in 2021. And again, it was just because it had a wet year. So, summary. Service capacity, I used to say 35,000. As reclaim becomes a bigger deal, I think it's stretched. And the more we can conserve from all of our sources, I think we're pushing 40,000 now and rising. So how long will it take us to build out a service capacity of 40,000? That's different than the city limits because we actually serve outside the city limits now instead of just inside. And there are areas of our city limits that are served by other utilities. San Jose, Kendall West used to serve it, and now it's Canyon Lake / San Jose. And so they're serving inside our city limits too, but our service capacity of our water system remains at about 35 to 40,000 gallons. Our commitment for lots that we have in various stages of development is 35,400. So I still contend that we have plenty of water for what we have committed to serve, and that is expanding as we continue to conserve. Of course, if we do decide to go out and start serving outside the city limits on a more routine basis to try to control that growth, that means we need more supply, and part of the reason you guys are sitting here. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions that you have. I think you've seen this before, but it bears repeating.
Well, as always, great information. Thank you, Mike. And if you don't mind, would you share that with us? I think it's a great resource, and even without you there to describe it, I think it's something that people would love to be able to have access to, and we'd like to put it on the website. Not that it's not already available, but the more people who see it, the more informed they'll be. So.
Sure, and some of this information is going to be available on our new water dashboard. So we have hired a young lady that just got her master's to create a water dashboard for us, and basically it's just going to be a multitude of sources. She's got a one-stop shop that we're going to be able to have on our website where somebody will be able to go in and look at well levels across the county, rain data, consumption data, and it can be expanded. The possibilities are endless with the thing. It's in the infancy stages, but we'll have it online soon.
And this is completely unrelated, but just I wanted to follow up. Since we had presentation to council on conservation issues, do you have any idea how things are progressing on that front?
I think we're talking about how to staff it right now, so it's moving forward.
Awesome. That's good news.
It's if we really want to have it make a dent, we need somebody that's almost devoted to it full time. Whether that's a part time or a full time employee is what we're still talking about.
That's great. Yeah, that was certainly our conclusion as well.
Yes, sir.
Any questions for Mr. Mann?
First comment is, thank you for your leadership on the wastewater treatment plant with the purple pipe solution, because we're, I think, pretty ahead of the state in this regard, is what it sounds like. I mean, yes, Canyon Lake Water Services, they're certainly going that direction, but I think you guys were some of the first out of the gate.
We are, yeah, and we're ahead of the state. So, I'd love to help TCEQ write some regulations on it, because it'll be beneficial to us all if it works. Mm-hmm. And if too many people try it and don't put the right kind of health and safety controls in, then it could have negative, if nothing else, negative publicity. Mm-hmm. Ours is doing great, and we do keep a chlorine residual in there, just like we do drinking water. It's not drinking water, mm-hmm. but it's treated for human contact without the chlorine, but we keep chlorine in it just to make doubly sure, and we get no complaints. So as long as everybody can keep up those kind of standards, I think it'll be successful.
Well, and thank you for that, because I know you were a lead on that. And also, I just want to recognize Bernie as a lead so far on that, on stormwater quality solutions, and also now with this Internet of Water, this water data hub. I think it's awesome that Bernie's innovating in this way. And so I hope our committee going forward can also be thinking in terms of being at the lead, being the first out of the gate.
We love to lead. We just have to be realistic in how much we do, because it still has to be funded by the taxpayers and ratepayers.
Oh, absolutely. Fair enough.
Any other questions or comments for Mike?
Patrick, I would just say that the city manager did direct me to take the committee's report and turn it into kind of an actionable steps for the city, which I'm glad to hear Mike saying that they're looking at the possible budget. That was one of the things that the committee recommended, and it's in there. But I was able to break it down into what could be done very short term, and then of course a longer term, and then longer than that. And so that has been delivered to Mr. Thatcher about 3-4 weeks ago.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate your continued efforts on that. All right, Mr. Mann, thank you.
Thank you.
Before we wrap, I had a handful of thoughts. Obviously, Donovan Burton wasn't able to present at today's meeting, so he's asked to defer till next meeting, so we look forward to hearing from him then. I also understand Ben and Jeff are working on some reclamation information so we can learn more about that topic, that subject matter. Are there other things that we need to be considering for the next meeting people want to hear about, talk about, that sort of thing?
So I do have, I did find Oceanside, California has a direct potable reuse system, although they do run it through the buffer of a groundwater ASR system. So they basically put it back underground and then pump it back out. And if you'd like, I can go ahead and send a link to a place where people can go ahead and do a little bit of homework on that, or just preview
Sounds
it.
great. More is better.
And then I'm hoping to get us somebody to present from there. They're first out of the gate, as far as I can tell, are one of them for real high quality, like super high quality water for direct potable reuse. And so they're getting a lot of phone calls from other people across the country asking some of the questions we're going to have, wanting to know about it.
Okay. And Mike, you may not have this, and it probably not even ripe at this point, but in terms of our cost on having reclaimed water, we're talking about our sources, and this is an interesting way to look at a source. It's probably not there yet, but there's a cost associated with providing the reclaimed water we're already providing.
Yes.
Can you ballpark that right now, or?
Well, the treatment cost is almost inherent. All we do is inject chlorine. So it's really about production, transportation and production. So if you want to look at, just again in round numbers, what's the difference between well water, which is free from the ground, just has to be pumped and transported, versus surface water that has a little more treatment and pumping? Probably about $1,000. That's why we're able to sell it cheaper than we do our potable water and encourage its use. Try to make it more attractive.
Okay, that helps from a perspective standpoint.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. All right, if there's nothing else, we're going to adjourn for today. If you have additional thoughts or comments, please share those, and we'll look into them in time for our next meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's a great meeting.